Hey there riders, Moto Journo Kris here today, and I've just been riding Yamaha's YZF-R1, or just the R1 as we tend to call it. And I've got to say, this bike is an absolute weapon. Having ridden the MT-10 just a couple of weeks ago, I was really impressed by the MT-10. I have to say, even now between the two bikes, I'd probably buy the MT-10 over the R1. However, that really comes down to what I'm after as a rider, and I'll explain that in a little bit more detail as this review goes on. But I just wanted to chat about the R1 essentially because I've had a heap of fun riding it. This is basically a brand new R1. I've had it for a couple of weeks. The weather hasn't been the greatest, so I haven't done a huge amount of kilometers, but I've spent a couple of good days on this particular bike. Got a bit of a feel for the bike as well, and it's really astonishing what Yamaha are offering in essentially a road-going superbike. The race pedigree of this machine is really direct, and I think in some ways the fact that there's the more road-orientated versions like the MT-10 has allowed Yamaha to further focus on the race and the track aspects of these bikes, which is a really good thing for people who are into that side of things. I'm really just a road rider. I don't mind doing the occasional track day, but at the end of the day, it's all about the road for me. And that's what I'm going to be focusing on in this review because I haven't taken this bike to the track. And while I think it would be quite fun, it's intimidating enough on the road. I think it'd be even more so for a newer and inexperienced rider or someone who's not a real track day junkie. But at the same time, what actually surprised me about this bike, and which aligns very closely with the MT-10, is just how easy it is to ride. It's a beautiful, really stable setup. It's got really nice feel and very well sorted suspension, particularly on the front end. It's got that beautiful cross-plane engine, which has this just amazing effortless power delivery that is really well fueled. I have to say I was particularly using the lower power modes simply to get that throttle response a little bit softer because it can be quite aggressive, and it's an incredibly punchy power plant as well. This thing to ride is just such a joy. It's beautiful. I found with these Q4 tires on it, it didn't really fall onto the side. It wasn't the sharpest steerer from those tires at least. However, the control and the stability was, really second to none from anything I've tested. Overall handling was like the bike was on rails, apart from the occasional harsh bump at the rear, while powering out on the throttle was the weapon of choice to steer out of corners, and handling was largely telepathic and as simple as looking as where I wanted to go. I will note, however, that I left the bike with some decently large chicken strips on the new Q4 tyres, and I just found myself carrying less lean angle than usual, but I'm not a knee-down type of rider at the best of times. For a tyre that is meant to offer a more aggressive profile, I also really didn't feel it with the Q4, but more restrained road speeds may have had something to do with that, while the tyre and the bike were entirely predictable. Now, while we're on the front of the bike, let me just point out some real standout features if you ask me. Those front KYB forks are outstanding. I have not touched a clicker on them. They are absolutely perfect for me as it stands, and that really works well with those 4-piston radial calipers. They are a beautiful combo. The amount of braking performance on this bike is staggering, but the level of control you have with those brakes as well is absolutely exceptional, which is what was such a standout to me because it's such a fast bike, but as you're coming into the corners, you've got a very tactile experience when it comes to using those front brakes. There's great power, but there's not a heap of dive because it's so well supported by those KYB forks. You can use as much braking performance as you want. There was a couple of times where I felt like I was using probably a little bit too much and the rear was getting quite light. However, at the end of the day, that suspension and brake setup on the front end is absolutely stunning. The front fairings have been revised. This is a 5% more aerodynamic efficiency model, which just means that it's got more top speed. There's no way I'd ever be able to make use of that personally as a road rider, but for the track day riders or the racers who are really pushing the limits, of course that's going to be a benefit. And it's got these really small LED lights as well as the larger kind of bug style headlights underneath, and the lighting on this bike is full LED. You've got the indicators in the mirrors. The mirrors themselves, the view through those, if you're just trundling around town, is decent. However, you'll find that when you're having a go out on the open road, even seeing behind you is quite hard because your elbows tend to be in the way. and I don't think really the good levels of adjustability within that system are enough to see around your elbows. But you know, it's a sports bike, and at the end of the day, that's just one of the features of a sports bike. It's very easy to crouch in below that dash, and there's a really beautiful, very clear TFT display that you can keep an eye on that really jumps out at you. I do have to say, when I see this display, even though I'm not a huge proponent of TFT displays being really necessary, I can see why such a clear display, particularly when you've got such an extensive electronics package, is such a good idea. And that electronics package, I'll put a little clip up of me going through it, but it's very easily managed, even just for someone jumping on the bike, which is a nice feature again, because it means that you're not having to get the user manual out to figure out what's going on as far as the electronics on the bike. Now, when it comes to the bike itself, this is absolutely packed with technology, even far more so than the MT10, which I recently tested. On this, you're getting such an extensive electronic system. I'm going to go through the dash in a little video and go through all of those settings, but easy to say, it's got a really extensive electronic system, which helps somewhat tame that cross-plane 4 engine, because at the end of the day, for road riding, I think it'd be very, very easy to get yourself into a little bit of strife on this machine, because there's just so much power there. I will say that at some of the lights, you know, I was taking off, I was feathering that clutch a little bit, taking off, not really using that much throttle, knock it up into second and kind of look down at the speedo and go, ooh, I'm going a lot faster than I probably should be, and it's very, very easy and effortless to do, and the stability and the feel from the bike mean that you don't even realize a lot of the time just how fast you're going. Of course, when you look in the rearview mirrors and you notice that you've left everyone back at the lights a significant distance behind, it becomes very, very clear what's happened there. But even with the lower power modes on this bike, it is absolutely capable of just taking off in crazy, crazy fashion. And I certainly wouldn't be disabling any of the electronics, which you can do, because when you do take off, if you give it a bit, that front gets very, very light and does start to lift without the lift control. And at the end of the day, you know, you can see this is a race bike registered for the road, and Yamaha haven't made too many compromises. So let's give you a quick look at the ergonomics of this particular machine. Jumping on the R1, it is an out-and-out sports bike. It's got a very aggressive reach to those bars. It's got a very tight amount of clearance with those bars at full lock. It isn't a hard machine to do a U-turn on. However, you do need to have plenty of room to do that because it's a sports bike. Also, the reach to those pegs is very, very small. It's something to keep in mind. And then of course, when you've got the balls of your feet up, it's even smaller. It is, at the end of the day, a real true sports bike. It even makes my Daytona 675 feel like quite a relaxed machine in comparison. Now, I can get both feet down flat. I'm 180 centimeters tall, and the seat height on this bike is 870 millimeters from memory. So it's a very, very tall seat height, and it is a very compact machine. When it comes to getting right down on the bike, there's no issues there. It's very, very easy to tuck in. It's a really compact seating position. As you can probably see, my elbows are basically touching my knees there in that kind of position. Obviously, I haven't got my balls of my feet up, which does move my knees down a little bit, but at the end of the day, it's a super, super compact machine, and you will definitely be tucking in to get away from that wind if you're having a bit of a go on that throttle. This generation of the R1 also weighs in just over the 200 kilo mark, and so while that is quite a competitive weight for a super bike, most of them are in that kind of region. Once you add fuel and liquids, you know, some of the manufacturers like to quote their dry figures, and it does kind of put the cat amongst the pigeons as to people who don't seem to understand the difference between dry and wet weight and the addition that the wet weight does add. But at the end of the day, I think that's quite competitive, and it's quite an easy machine to roll around the garage as well. It's exceptionally well balanced, which also extends to that low speed riding through town. It's got a 17-litre tank. The fuel economy on this bike, I think fill ups, I was getting for about, say, 150 kilometres, about 10.5 litres. That might be a little bit better than the MT10, but it's still not amazing. But that's enough to get you between fuel stops here in Australia at least. A 200-kilometre range is a pretty good range if you ask me, and it's capable of that. And while it doesn't have a fuel gauge, it's got a trip meter, it's got a clock on the dash, things that I like to see. And it is quite easy to keep an eye on kind of your fuel efficiency because it has a live feed which basically shows you about approximately how much fuel you're using on the run, and so you can work it out in your head from there. You've got this very, very race-styled seat. It's quite a hard seat. I found if I wasn't holding myself up on the pegs through the sportier stuff, it was quite a punishing seat over the longer distances or longer time in the saddle. But again, that's part of it being a sports bike. If I was holding myself up off the bike and using my core muscles and my legs on those pegs, much less of an issue. But I will say, with such an aggressive reach to those bars, you need really good core strength to ride this bike for extended periods of time. Otherwise, you'll be putting a lot of your weight onto your wrists, which is obviously not ideal. And particularly if you're braking really hard, you'll be taking a lot of the weight through your wrists, and it really gives your legs a workout. Spending about 300 kilometers on this bike the other day, the next day when I woke up, I thought, oh, my back's not too bad. I was feeling, you know, that the lower back was getting a real workout because of just holding myself up and all those core muscles. However, it was my legs which I really noticed were quite sore the following day, as well as my bum, because that seat is quite hard. Obviously, this is not a touring bike, so you don't expect long distance comfort to be a primary aspect of the bike. Now, that cross-plane inline 4-cylinder engine is the real standout on the R1, despite the fact that the overall package is astounding, really. That cross-plane engine, the way it develops power, it is so effortless. It's got a beautiful feeling of traction. I have to say, compared to the old Big Bang R1, which I was never such a fan of because I felt almost as though there was a little bit of a disconnect between the throttle and the bike and the rider, for me at least, just for me as a rider. With the cross-plane inline 4, in this particular model, there's much more of a connection. But I will say the way it produces power is so effortless and really quite aggressive in most of the scenarios, unless you put it in, you know, power mode 4 and you're taking it really easy. At the end of the day, I did prefer the MT10 implementation, which has a bit more of a feeling of torque to it and is a little bit more restrained, because I think it would be very easy for me to lose my license on this R1, and by the same note, it's very easy to get yourself into trouble. On the bright side, the suspension and the brakes are so good that it's also quite easy to get yourself out of trouble. However, you really have to respect Yamaha's R1 because it is an absolute beast. It is absolutely crazy, even with all of those electronics there to try and keep you safe. Now, back here at the rear of the bike, I did want to talk about a couple of the things which I found a little bit on the disappointing side, and they're very small criticisms. Number one, that stock exhaust system is way too quiet. I feel like the earlier generation R1 had a fair bit more volume to it from the exhaust and from the engine growl, which seems to have been tamed down a little bit. That might be because of Euro 5. I mean, the restrictions are getting really ridiculous. I would love for this thing to have a bit more growl to it. Obviously, you can buy an aftermarket exhaust to put on, and that would be one of my first thoughts to put onto a bike like this, even though I'd be buying the MT10. But at the end of the day, even though it's got a nice growl to it, an engine growl to it, it's a bit quiet really, and I haven't had much luck capturing that engine growl on my onboard videos, which I'm a bit sad about as well, because it is there, particularly as you really roll on that throttle quite hard further up in the rev range, but it's just super quiet. Apart from that, the rear brake is quite weak, which is not unexpected. Really strong brakes on a sports bike. The rear brake just tends to be for a little bit of extra control and maybe around town, and that's certainly the case here. Switching between the two brake modes, which apparently optimize between cornering braking and straight line braking, it didn't seem to make much of a difference on that rear brake. You have to give it a huge amount of pressure, really stamp down on the rear brake to get a lot of performance out of it, which you don't really want to do on a bike like this. But in stark contrast to how amazingly good the front brakes are, the rear brakes seem to be very restrained in comparison. And I mean, it's not really a problem on a style of bike like this, but it is a point that I thought I'd note for those who really like using the rear brake to a huge amount. Now, as you can tell, I was highly impressed with Yamaha's 2020 R1, while at the same time being able to safely say I wouldn't buy one. It's not you, R1, it's me. It's too much bike for me, being honest, and while I could certainly have some fun on one, which is a testament to Yamaha's good work, the MT-10 just makes more sense across basically every metric for me, even if I do love the look of the R1 fairings and headlight. That's not to say the R1 doesn't outshine the MT-10 in certain areas. The electronics are impressive, if offering way more than I need, and the gearbox is noticeably slicker, as is the quick shifter. I really didn't make much use of the down quick shifter though, and the extra performance was realistically wasted on me, and I must be aging as I'm gravitating away from the full-on sports bike theme these days. There's no denying that Yamaha have something special though with the current R1, and the crossplane engine is certainly a large part of it. What do you think of the latest iteration of the R1? Is this the superbike you'd pick of the current crop? If you've enjoyed the video, don't forget to sub and hit that notification bell, leave a comment below, and as always, stay safe out there and thanks for watching.